The torrential rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand hall, each drop a tiny fist beating against the glass, mirroring the violent storm gathering inside Jae-sun Park's chest. He stood frozen, his silhouette a stark, unyielding line of black against the stormy, gray cityscape beyond. His gaze was locked, not on the billion-dollar view, but on the delicate glint of gold at the base of his new maid's throat. A tremor, born of 5 years of carefully buried grief, shot through his hand, causing the crystal glass he held to vibrate with a low, dangerous hum. The object was unmistakable, a sunburst locket on a fine, twisted chain, an echo of a ghost he had forbidden from these halls. Time seemed to warp, the air growing thick and heavy with memories of laughter, of whispered promises under moonlit skies, of the scent of jasmine that had vanished from his world forever. His voice, when it finally tore from his throat, was not the measured tone of a corporate titan but the raw, ragged cry of a man flayed open. "That's my late wife's necklace." The shout was an explosion, shattering the funereal quiet of the mansion. Alara, who had been meticulously dusting a marble pedestal, flinched as if struck. The light blue of her uniform seemed to shrink in the cavernous space, her own world suddenly reduced to the terrifying focus of this powerful, grieving man. Her hand flew instinctively to the locket, her fingers closing around the familiar, cool metal. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. She saw the accusation in his eyes, a tempest of disbelief and fury that threatened to drown her. This man, Mr. Park, her employer of only 3 weeks, looked at her as if she were a grave robber, a ghoul who had desecrated the most sacred of tombs. The sheer force of his anguish pinned her to the spot, stealing the air from her lungs. She could only stare back, her wide, dark eyes reflecting his own fractured image. Jae-sun Park took a step forward, then another, his movements stiff, predatory. The ice in his abandoned glass cracked, a sound as sharp as a breaking bone in the suffocating silence that followed his outburst. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl that was somehow more terrifying than his shout. He was invading her space, his towering frame casting a long, oppressive shadow over her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to apologize, to tear the necklace from her neck and let it fall to the cold marble floor. But something held her fast. It was the memory of a promise, the weight of a dying woman's trust, a gift given not of wealth but of spirit. She had worn it every day for 5 years, a secret talisman against a world that had offered her little kindness. It was hers. A profound, unshakable certainty rose through her fear, straightening her spine. This cold, intimidating man did not know the whole story, and his grief, however vast, did not give him the right to brand her a thief. She met his stormy gaze, her chin lifting with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. The words were quiet, yet they seemed to carve through the tension-choked air with the clarity of a bell. "She gave it to me," Alara said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "Your wife, Serafina. She gave it to me herself. The day that she died, the statement hung between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of sorrow and suspicion, and Jae-sun Park's face contorted, the accusation in his eyes hardening into the cold, sharp certainty of betrayal. He would not believe it. He recoiled as if her words were a physical blow, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Impossible," he hissed, the single word laced with the venom of 5 years of unanswered questions. He turned away, stalking towards the massive fireplace where no fire burned, its cold hearth a monument to the warmth that had died with his wife. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled black hair, the gesture ragged with a desperation he rarely allowed to surface. Serafina was at the cliffs, alone. It was an accident, the official story, the one repeated in hushed tones at board meetings and sympathetic dinners, the lie he had forced himself to swallow to keep from going mad. To even suggest otherwise was to disturb a grave he had spent half a decade sealing shut. He spun back to face her, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, undiluted suspicion. "You are a liar, or a thief, or something far, far worse." His mind, honed by years of corporate warfare, began to race, connecting invisible dots, seeing conspiracies in the shadows. Was this a ploy? A cruel trick orchestrated by a rival? His nemesis, Arthur, would stoop to anything. He envisioned this young woman, with her innocent face and quiet dignity, as a weapon, a Trojan horse brought into the heart of his sanctuary to dismantle him from the inside out. He called for his head of security on his private line. Elias. We have a situation. He then turned his attention to his most trusted advisor, a man who had been his father's right hand before his own. Vance, he said into the phone, his voice tight with controlled fury. Get to the house. Now he disconnected, the silence of the hall pressing in on him again, thick with the scent of rain and the ghost of jasmine. He looked at Alara, not as a woman, but as a puzzle he had to solve, a threat he had to neutralize. The necklace was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a key, and he feared, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that it unlocked a door he had long since bricked over. In the quiet solitude of her small, sparse room in the staff quarters, Alara sat on the edge of her bed, the locket now resting in her palm. The polished gold felt warm against her skin, a stark contrast to the icy dread that had settled in her heart. She traced the sunburst pattern with her thumb, a ritual she had performed 1,000 times before. It had always brought her comfort, a tangible link to the only moment of pure, unconditional kindness she had ever known. Now, it felt like a brand, a mark that had cast her into a storm she could not navigate. Her mind drifted back, away from the cold marble halls and the accusatory glare of Mr. Park, to a windswept cliff overlooking a churning gray sea. She had been just 20, a tourist working a summer job at a seaside cafe, taking a walk on her day off. She'd found a woman sitting on a bench, her elegant clothes out of place against the rugged landscape, her face a mask of serene sadness. It was Serafina. Alara hadn't known her name then. She was just a beautiful, heartbroken stranger. They had talked for hours, a strange and immediate intimacy forming between two women from opposite ends of the universe. Serafina had spoken of love and duty, of secrets that felt like stones in her pockets, of a promise she feared she couldn't keep. As the sky began to bleed into the colors of sunset, Serafina had unclasped the necklace. Take this, she had urged, pressing it into Alara's hand. A promise for promise. When the time comes, it will show you the way. Don't let the darkness win. Alara hadn't understood, but she had seen the desperate sincerity in the woman's eyes. An hour later, sirens had screamed along the coastal road. The beautiful stranger was gone, a tragic headline about a fall, an accident. Alara had kept her promise, wearing the necklace, waiting for a time that never seemed to come, until now. The investigation began with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. Jason Park, sequestered in his obsidian and steel office, watched the city lights ignite below, each one a distant, cold star. He felt untethered, adrift in a sea of doubt. His conversation with Vance had done little to soothe him. Vance, ever the pragmatist, had gently but firmly steered Jason Park's suspicion towards corporate espionage. Arthur has been trying to get inside your walls for years, Jason, Vance had said, using Jason Park's Korean name, a tactic reserved for moments of grave intimacy. A new maid, a priceless heirloom appearing out of nowhere? The timing is too perfect. She is a plant. The logic was cold and inescapable, appealing to the part of Jason Park that understood strategy and betrayal. Yet, something felt wrong. A dissonant note in a perfectly composed symphony of deceit. He had looked into Alara's eyes and seen not cunning, but a profound, terrifying innocence. It was a look he remembered from long ago, in another woman's eyes. He pushed the thought away, branding it a weakness. He had instructed Elias, a man whose loyalty was forged in steel, to dig into Alara's life, to dissect her past until every secret was laid bare. Elias worked through the night, his team of digital ghosts sifting through databases and public records. The report he delivered the next morning was both thorough and deeply unsatisfying. Alara's life was a testament to quiet struggle. Orphaned young, a series of foster homes, scholarships earned through sheer grit, jobs taken to stay afloat. There were no hidden accounts, no shell corporations, no burner phones, no connection whatsoever to Arthur or any of his known associates. She was exactly what she appeared to be, an ordinary young woman trying to survive. It's too clean, Jason Park had murmured, staring at the file. Elias nodded in agreement. Or, he offered, his voice low, it's simply the truth. The possibility was terrifying. If she was telling the truth, then the official story of Serafina's death, the story he had built his sanity upon, was a lie. Days bled into a week of suffocating tension. The mansion, once a silent tomb of grief, was now a prison of suspicion. Jae-sun Park's demeanor towards Alara became a study in controlled hostility. He watched her constantly, his gaze a physical weight she could feel from across a room. He would appear silently in doorways as she worked, his presence a silent accusation. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and cold, devoid of any warmth. Alara moved through the house like a wraith, performing her duties with meticulous precision, her face an impassive mask that betrayed none of the fear churning within her. The light blue uniform felt like a target on her back. Vance became a more frequent presence in the house, his calm, reassuring voice a constant murmur in Jae-sun Park's ear, subtly poisoning the well. He would point out small things, Alara lingering too long near the study, a phone call she took in the garden, and twist them into signs of espionage. Her file is clean because she's a professional, Jae-sun, he would reason. The best operatives are the ones who look like nobody. For Alara, the grand house became a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. She felt Vance's eyes on her too, but his gaze was different from Jae-sun Park's. It was calculating, cold, like a snake observing its prey. She took to hiding the necklace beneath her uniform, but she could still feel its presence, a cold, heavy secret against her heart. One evening, driven by a desperate need for answers, she found herself in the mansion's library, a vast, two-story room filled with the scent of old paper and leather. She ran her fingers along the spines of books Serafina might have touched, searching for a connection, for some sign that she wasn't going mad. On a low shelf, she found a collection of leather-bound photo albums. Her hands trembling, she opened one. There she was, Serafina, smiling, vibrant, full of a life that had been so cruelly extinguished. And in every photo, around her neck, was the sunburst locket. The truth of it, the undeniable proof, was a fresh stab of pain. But as she turned a page, she saw a photo of Serafina at a charity gala, laughing with Vance. His arm was around her, his smile broad, but his eyes, even in the faded photograph, held that same cold, possessive light. A shiver traced its way down her spine. Elias, unbound by Vance's narrative of corporate espionage, pursued a different path. He was a man who trusted instinct over algorithm, and his gut told him the answer wasn't in a database. It was buried with the dead. He focused on the day of Serafina's death, pulling the original police reports, witness statements, and coroner's notes. Everything pointed to a tragic accident, a slip on loose gravel near the cliff's edge. But one detail snagged his attention. A groundskeeper at the nearby coastal park, Jedediah, had quit his job the very next day, citing a family emergency. He had then vanished, leaving no forwarding address. It took Elias 3 days of relentless, old-fashioned detective work to find him. Jedediah was living in a small, run-down cabin deep in the mountains, a man who had clearly run from the world. He was old now, his hands gnarled by arthritis, his eyes clouded with a guilt he had carried for 5 long years. At first, he refused to speak, his fear a palpable thing. But Elias, with his quiet patience, broke through the old man's walls. He spoke of justice, of giving a ghost a voice. Finally, sitting on his dusty porch as the sun set behind the peaks, Jedediah's story came pouring out. "I saw her that day," he whispered, his voice raspy with disuse. "Mrs. Park." She wasn't alone. He described how Serafina had been arguing with a man near the cliff's edge. A heated, desperate argument. He couldn't hear the words, only the tone. He had thought about intervening but had been afraid to involve himself with such powerful people. He had turned away, pretending to work, and that's when he heard the scream. When he looked back, she was gone, and the man was standing alone at the edge, looking down. He had slipped away before the authorities arrived, terrified that the man would see him. "Who was it?" Elias asked, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "Who was the man on the cliff?" Jedediah looked up, his old eyes filled with a terrible clarity. "It was him," he said, his voice cracking. "The other one. The one who was always with Mr. Park." The advisor, Mr. Vance. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, settled over Alara. The photograph in the library had planted a seed of unease that had been growing ever since. It was in the way Vance watched her, the way his smile never quite reached his cold, assessing eyes. She knew she was in danger, a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand. She had to find proof, something tangible that would make Jae-sun Park believe her, something that would cut through Vance's web of lies. She remembered seeing Vance use a small, private office on the third floor, a room rarely entered by staff. An opportunity arose when Jae-sun Park called an emergency meeting downtown, taking Vance with him. The house was quiet. With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she slipped into the forbidden room. It was impeccably neat, a sterile space of chrome and black leather. It felt lifeless, except for the faint, cloying scent of Vance's expensive cologne. She didn't know what she was looking for. She started with the desk, her fingers flying through drawers filled with mundane paperwork. Nothing. She checked the bookshelves behind the formidable-looking law tomes. Still nothing. Panic began to set in. This was a mistake. She was about to leave when her gaze fell upon a heavy, ornate wooden box on the credenza. It seemed out of place in the modern office. Her instincts screamed at her. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among stock certificates and property deeds, was a thin, black leather folder. She opened it. The first page was a bank statement showing a series of large, untraceable wire transfers into an offshore account in Vance's name. The sender was a shell corporation. The next page was a blueprint, a detailed plan for the hostile takeover of Park Industries. The architect of the plan, the name signed at the bottom of the memorandum, was Arthur. It was all there, the betrayal, the conspiracy, the motive. Serafina must have discovered this. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. As she stared at the damning evidence, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't been quiet enough. She grabbed the folder, shoved it under her uniform, and slipped out a side door, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the shadow of a security guard, one of Vance's men, passing the main entrance. The trap was set. Armed with Jedediah's testimony from Elias and the explosive documents from Alara, Jae-sun Park moved with the cold, precise fury of an avenging angel. He understood everything now. The necklace hadn't been a sign for him to move on. It had been a message from the grave, delivered by the most unlikely of messengers. Serafina had entrusted the truth to a stranger, a failsafe against the man she knew would kill her to protect his secret. The grief in Jae-sun Park's heart did not lessen. It transformed, crystallizing into a diamond-hard resolve for justice. He scheduled an emergency board meeting under the guise of finalizing a merger with a European firm, a deal Arthur had been desperate to sabotage. It was the perfect bait. The boardroom was a cavern of polished mahogany and tension. Jae-sun Park stood at the head of the long table, a portrait of calm authority, while Arthur sat to his right, smug and expectant, and Vance stood behind him, the loyal advisor. Alara, flanked by Elias, waited in an adjacent room, the leather folder clutched in her hands. Jae-sun Park began the meeting, his voice even as he outlined the merger's final details. Then he paused. However, he said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Arthur. Before we sign, there is another matter of business to attend to. The matter of my wife's death. A shocked silence fell over the room. Arthur paled. Vance's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. For 5 years, I believed it was an accident. Jae-sun Park continued, his voice dropping, each word a hammer blow. I was wrong. She was murdered. Murdered to protect a conspiracy to destroy this company from within. He locked eyes with Vance. A conspiracy orchestrated by you? Vance, on behalf of the man sitting to my right. He gestured to the door. Elias. Elias entered, followed by Alara, who walked with a quiet dignity that defied the fear she felt. She placed the black folder on the table in front of Jae-sun Park. What is the meaning of this? Arthur blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. Who is this woman? Jae-sun Park's voice was ice. This is the woman who holds the truth. He opened the folder, revealing the bank statements, the takeover plans. And this, he said, his voice rising with righteous fury, is the proof of your treason. Panic flared in Vance's eyes. The calm, collected facade shattered, revealing the desperate animal beneath. Before anyone could react, he lunged not at Jason Park, but at Alara, pulling a small, silver pistol from the inside of his jacket. "Nobody move," he snarled, grabbing her, pressing the cold barrel of the gun to her temple. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Directors scrambled back from the table, their faces masks of terror. Arthur sank into his chair, his face ashen, exposed and powerless. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, the scent of Vance's cologne and the cold metal against her skin filling her senses. Jason Park's heart stopped. The sight of Alara in peril, a mirror of the fate that had befallen his wife, ignited a primal, protective instinct within him. He saw Serafina on the cliff, helpless. He would not let it happen again. "Let her go, Vance," he said, his voice dangerously calm as he began to circle the table, drawing the traitor's attention. "It's over. There's no escape." Elias, moving with silent, deadly grace along the opposite wall, began to close the distance. "You took everything from me?" Vance screamed, his voice cracking, his eyes wild. "I built this empire with your father while you were just a boy. It should have been mine." The confession hung in the air, a testament to a lifetime of bitter resentment. In that split second of distraction, as Vance's gaze flickered towards Jason Park, Elias made his move. He launched himself at Vance, a blur of motion. The gun went off, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet shattered a window, raining glass onto the street below. Alara was thrown to the floor as Elias and Vance crashed against the mahogany table. Jason Park was at her side in an instant, shielding her with his own body as the two men grappled for the weapon. Another shot fired, this one muffled, followed by a grunt of pain. Elias subdued the wounded Vance, wrenching the pistol from his grasp. Security flooded the room, seizing a whimpering Arthur and a bleeding, defeated Vance. It was over. In the ringing silence, amidst the wreckage of his life, Jason Park looked down at Alara, her eyes wide with shock, and felt the first tremor of a world rebuilding itself from the ashes. In the cool, quiet aftermath, long after the police had gone and the shattered glass had been swept away, Jason Park and Alara stood on his private balcony, the city lights spread before them like a carpet of fallen stars. The air was clean, washed by the earlier rain. The weight of 5 years of lies had been lifted, leaving behind a hollowed-out landscape of grief and truth. Jason Park held the sunburst locket in his hand, its gold surface catching the ambient light. He looked from it to Alara, who stood wrapped in a cashmere blanket he had given her, her light blue uniform finally discarded. He saw her now not as a maid, not as a symbol, but as the brave, resilient woman who had walked through fire to deliver a dead woman's message. "She trusted you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "A complete stranger. She saw the strength in you that I was too blind with my own pain to recognize." He gently placed the necklace back into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "It's yours. It was always meant to be yours." It was her legacy, her final move in a game she knew she was going to lose. Alara looked down at the locket, then back at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She told me not to let the darkness," when a sad smile touched Jason Park's lips. "And you didn't." A new understanding passed between them, a bond forged in trauma and truth, deeper than romance, more profound than gratitude. It was a partnership of survivors. The next day, Jason Park announced the formation of the Serafina Park Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing opportunities and support for disenfranchised young people, with its first endowment going to the foster care system that had shaped Alara. He asked her to sit on its board, to guide its mission. Her purpose was no longer to serve in his house, but to help build a legacy of hope from the ruins of tragedy, ensuring that Serafina's light, entrusted to a stranger on a cliffside, would never be extinguished.